Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome to this week's episode of The Examined Life with Phil. And this was going to turn out to be our Christmas episode, since it's getting released the Friday before Christmas. So in light of that, I was trying to rack my brain, see if I could come up with something that was, philosophically Christmas relevant. So I'm going to do something that's a little bit more apologetic central than I've done in any of the other episodes, and that's, I'm going to see if we can shed a little light on the question, can we show, demonstrate, or in any sense prove that the Christmas story happened, and albeit trying to apply some rigorous methods to that and see what we can come up with. So part of what prompted my thinking on this subject is a Christmas season sermon that I heard a pastor give one time. He was talking about some aspects of the lead up to Christ's birth in Luke. I think it was when Mary went to visit Elizabeth. And he made the comment that you don't need to prove that the Christmas story is real. And I found that a little odd, troubling, and the reason I found that odd or troubling is if you go back and read the introduction to Luke, the very first chapter and verse, he says, quote, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." And I showed that to my wife at the time the guy was giving that sermon, and she was also a little miffed by that. Now, know with certainty may not be exactly the same as proof. It isn't. But it does kind of seem like Luke was putting a bit more faith in his account that he was recording there than that particular pastor was. So, can you know, in any sense of know, that the Christmas story happened? Well, you do need to distinguish between different types of know here, because when we're talking about the Christmas story, we're talking about a historical event, or at least potentially a historical event. And you obviously can't know that in the same sense that you can know that you're listening to Phil Kallberg talk in a podcast. You know you're listening to me right now because you have an immediate experience of that. And if you get really deep into epistemology, there's various theories and people try to find problems with that, but if we just grant that for the moment, that you know you're listening to me because you have an immediate experience of that, well, that's probably pretty reasonable and fair, but you obviously can't know anything that happened in the past in history that way. Maybe you could if you were there experiencing it, but we're not talking about something that was 2,000 years ago. So there's obviously a different sense of know there. So you'd have to say you can know it in a historical sense, like I know that World War II happened, or I know that the 300 Spartans fought at the Battle of Thermopylae. Well, actually, there was a lot more than 300. The movie kind of distorted that. But I'm sure you can get the point there. And so referring back to that sermon, if that pastor meant you don't need to prove it in a bang your fist on the table absolute certainty sense, well, then he's quite right. But a little reflection reveals that we can't prove very many things at all in that sense, much less historical things. And so we really need to be asking this question more in a sense of, well, can we verify or establish the Christmas story in the same way that we would verify or establish World War II or the Battle of Thermopylae and so on and so forth. And so that's the reason why when it comes to these kind of things, what I like to talk about is not proof or certainty, but I like to say it's better to think of these things by veracity. Veracity is defined as conformity to facts, or accuracy, maybe habitual truthfulness. So when people will ask you things like if you can prove the Bible or prove the Christmas story, I can almost guarantee you those same people just really don't have much of an idea of what they mean by the word prove, as to prove something is not at all a simple concept. Proof is an umbrella term that's often used very ambiguously by many different people. Different things can and cannot be proven in a very different sense. The easy example is you have a very different burden of proof in a criminal case than you do in a civil case. It's easier to win in a civil case because the burden of proof is lower. And as an easy example of things that are absolutely certain or proven beyond any doubt would be something like math. A mathematician can prove with absolute certainty that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. This can be demonstrated over and over again in that we know enough about the numbers 2 and 4 and the concept of addition that we can say that 2 and 2 will always equal 4. But in general, most things that we talk of as proven are not really proven in this sense. A criminal prosecutor almost never proves a criminal committed a crime in this absolute sense, as that's pretty much impossible. And that's why, as a general rule, the courts will say that the criminal's guilt must be established beyond a reasonable doubt. Not that there is no doubt, but that those doubts are no longer reasonable. And that's an acknowledgement that it's impossible to absolutely prove something that happened in the past, that is, a historical event. We cannot repeat events that happened in the past, and as such, we can never prove them absolutely. However, a prosecutor could absolutely prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a criminal committed a crime. In many cases, such things can be established to such a high degree of certainty that it'd be irrational and stupid to doubt them. And so, most things that are historical and archaeological are proven in this second sense, not the first absolute sense. That's where we're determining what probably happened. You can always come up with some kind of a doubt, but at a certain point the doubts are unreasonable. Both the disciplines of archaeology and history use scientific tests in gathering evidence to help them determine what probably happened, but the claims of history and archaeology are not testable and provable in the same sense that, say, math equations are. So just an easy example of how this works. Nearly all the available evidence, and some of this evidence was acquired through tests developed by the scientific method, nearly all of that evidence indicates that the Egyptians built the pyramids at Giza a long time ago. But the entirety of this event can never be tested or demonstrated. It's just impossible to recreate all the conditions under which the pyramids were built and see if the ancient Egyptians do it again. You can't test that in a lab like that. So while there are some difficulties with the explanation that the Egyptians built the pyramid, like some people will object, well, how did they move all these heavy stones under just manpower without the wheels and things like that? But still, the explanation, the Egyptians built the pyramids a long time ago, makes sense out of nearly all the available evidence, and it far outstrips any other theory in terms of how much it explains, its adherence to the available evidence, that is, how well it fits the data and evidence we have, and the degree of ad hocness. Ad hocness is a term for, it's a Latin term, it means for that, and the idea is, well, did we just invent this theory out of nowhere to explain this fact? And clearly we did not. You see examples of peoples in ancient times building things, and the Egyptians in ancient times building things. So this is a very, very rough and loose example of how this type of reasoning works. It's sometimes called an appeal to the best explanation, and so it's good and valid, and unless we get some more information or more data later, we're very well justified in believing the Egyptians built the pyramids at Giza a long, long time ago. But the very nature of that claim, the Egyptians built the pyramids at Giza a long time ago, makes it impossible to ever repeat and therefore ever absolutely prove in that dead certain, bang your fist on the table kind of certainty. Now, there are actually many different senses of how things are and are not proven, and some of the elements of how things are proven are actually in contention between philosophers of knowledge and philosophers of science. But pretty much everyone generally agrees on the distinction I'm making here between proof, absolute certainty, veracity, and so on. It's just simply impossible for any human being to absolutely prove anything about the past or claims that any text or ancient text or book makes, including the Bible. And if that's what the pastor giving that sermon meant, point well taken. So if you're talking to somebody who's skeptical about the Bible, scripture, who says the Christmas story didn't happen, Jesus was a myth, or something relatively crazy like that, usually one of the first things you need to do is get them to recognize this distinction, because most of them don't. Rather, they usually attempt to hold Scripture to a standard of absolute proof that is appropriate in something like mathematics, but not in the case of historical claim. If all of history and all the ancient documents were held to such a standard, then we'd have to be highly skeptical about the existence of nearly all historical figures and events. There's a parody group on Facebook called Lincoln is a Myth, or something along those lines, that makes fun of people who claim that Jesus is a myth, that Jesus never lived, by parodying their arguments and just inserting Abraham Lincoln in instead. It's really quite funny. And what they're doing is demonstrating the point that if you were just as skeptical of, say, the existence of Abraham Lincoln as many of these people are of Christ, you would never be able to prove that Abraham Lincoln existed. and that's obviously crazy. Now, the traditional Christmas story you have in your head where the angels appear to the shepherds, Mary and Joseph are in a stable, Mary gives birth to Jesus and puts him in a manger, the wise men come, Herod gets really upset about all this and sends his soldiers to Bethlehem to kill all the children there, and Joseph and Mary escape to Egypt. That traditional story you have in mind and comes from a combination of the details that are given in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really doesn't list anything. It starts much more philosophically, so it's really just from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are really ancient documents that were written as Gospels to explain the life of Jesus. So for context, for what we're doing here, it's kind of appropriate to look at other ancient documents and consider Matthew, Mark, and Luke in at least somewhat of the same light. So I'm a philosopher, and as such, you can imagine I spent a great deal of time, maybe more than I should have, looking at the works of people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so on and so forth. And we only know about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle through other ancient documents, which are originally even older than those of the Gospels. Now, generally speaking, every concern or objection you've ever heard as to why you can't trust the Bible or why you can't trust the Gospels, they're too old, they were written too late, they contain errors, they were monkeyed with by other people, and so on and so forth. Every single one of those problems that somebody's going to bring up to you as to why they can't trust the Bible, that actually does apply to the philosophical texts that we learn about Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato from. So, for example, Socrates, he's generally thought of as kind of the father of philosophy. It's really not that simple because there were philosophers before him, but if you go to an intro to philosophy class, you're almost certainly going to be learning about Socrates first. Well, Socrates wrote nothing down. At least nothing that survives or that we have any records of. In fact, the records we do have indicate he didn't write anything down and didn't think it would be a good idea to write any of his philosophy down. All the records we have of him, therefore, are indirect, in that it's not coming from Socrates' own pen or mouth, it's coming from what Plato or somebody else reported about Socrates. So with Socrates, there are three primary sources. There's Plato, who used Socrates in nearly all of his famous dialogues, a guy named Xenophon, who was a contemporary of Socrates, and Plato's student Aristotle, who referenced Socrates periodically as one of the philosophers he was building on and said a few things that Plato didn't. And there's some other miscellaneous sources that aren't near as useful or valuable as well. Now, it's doubtful that Aristotle would ever have met Socrates. I can't recall off the top of my head when the birth and death dates there meet up, but Aristotle was Plato's student, so he's probably a generation removed from Socrates, give or take a little bit. And that would leave Plato and Xenophon as Socrates' contemporaries who interacted with Socrates in his life, and of those two sources, it's fairly generally accepted that Plato's probably the best. Socrates speaks in 28 out of 30 Platonic dialogues, and Plato seems to provide the best and most vivid picture of Socrates as an individual and give him the most philosophical depth. However, there is a further problem we have to deal with here. And this problem is what they call in philosophy the Socratic problem. And that is that it's widely accepted by everyone that at some point Plato stops accurately reporting on Socrates' own ideas in philosophy and starts using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. To quote the philosopher Bertrand Russell here, with Plato's account of Socrates, the difficulty is that it is very hard to judge how far Plato means to portray the historical Socrates and how far he intends the person called Socrates in his dialogues to be merely the mouthpiece of his own opinions. Plato, in addition to being a philosopher, is an imaginative writer of great genius and charm. No one supposes, and he himself does not seriously pretend, that the conversations in his dialogues took place just as he records them. Nevertheless, at any rate, in the earlier dialogues, the conversation is completely natural and the characters quite convincing. It is the excellence of Plato as a writer of fiction that throws doubt on him as a historian. His Socrates is a consistent and extraordinarily interesting character, far beyond the power of most men to invent. So the question is not if Plato sort of used and abused Socrates for his own purposes later when he was writing his dialogues. He definitely did. The question is how and when this occurred. Is it only the earlier dialogues that are authentic? Is it a gradual change? And so on and so forth. And that's the Socratic problem. So the point of all that is that when we're discussing who and what Socrates is, what we can say about his life, what he thought and what he taught, what he did, The primary and best source is Plato, and it's a muddled source, and we know that. But how many of you think that because of this problem, philosophers and Socratic scholars have just concluded that Socrates didn't exist, or that he's only an invention of Plato and other later authors? Well, if you guessed any, you'd be absolutely wrong. Virtually no one thinks that. I'm unaware of a single person who's actually educated in this subject who actually argues that. Now, how many of you think that most philosophers agree Socrates existed, but we can't really know anything about who he was or what he taught? Again, if you said some of them do, you'd be pretty much entirely wrong. The answer is virtually no one. I have a book on my shelf that's just on the religion of Socrates, what he thought about God and gods, that's over 300 pages long. It's called The Religion of Socrates by, I think the philosophy professor's out of Canada named Mark McFerrin. Great book. Obviously, we can know quite a bit about him if somebody's written a book that's over 300 pages long. In fact, nearly all the philosophers and scholars who look at Socrates agree about some key components and ideas about who Socrates was, what his life was like, and what he taught and what his ideas are. There is disagreement about fringe areas and things like that, but no one concludes that we don't have the teaching of Socrates at all. And so the point here is that despite the fact that all the records of Socrates are indirect and the best source is muddled, we still have a pretty decent idea of who Socrates was, what he taught, and the events of his life. We have a whole method of philosophy called the Socratic method that's named after him. And ironically enough, since we're talking about the Christmas story here, Socrates' Socratic method is actually very similar to the way Christ taught, in that with the Socratic method, what you do is you continually ask questions until you get at the very thing or the idea. And if you go read the Gospels, when Christ is teaching, he routinely answers questions with questions to get at the heart of the matter. Now, you'll often hear objections to the Gospels and other parts of the Bible that are similar to the objections you would think people would raise to our knowledge of Socrates. Christ didn't write anything down. All the records that we have of him are indirect in this sense, in that they were written by his followers and disciples and perhaps other eyewitnesses, maybe some who these people interviewed, as Luke indicates that he does in the opening of his Gospel. And further, you'll sometimes hear people argue that, well, Luke and Matthew and John and Mark, they all put, and even later Paul, they all put their own bent on what Jesus had to say. They took what they liked, tossed out what they didn't like, etc., etc., and so we don't really have a good, clear picture of Christ's teachings. Well, I hope you're beginning to see the double standard that's being applied here, because if we applied that same level of skepticism to Socrates, we'd have to conclude we don't really know much anything about him other than that a guy named Socrates existed. But we don't do that. That's ridiculous, and nobody who studies Socrates does that. The only place you ever hear that level of skepticism is generally when people are talking about Christ and things like the Christmas story. And so it's almost certainly unjustified. And so that's a double standard that needs to be called out. Now, moving on in history a little bit, for another example, let's look at the works of the great philosopher Aristotle. Well, after the fall of the Roman Empire, most of Aristotle's works were lost. So many of his works were lost that from about 500 A.D. to around 12 or 1300, Plato was considered the premier philosopher in Europe because he's all they had. Now, this started to change around 1400 A.D., give or take a little bit, and the reason why is because Crusaders were going off to the east, and they found out that a lot of the Muslims had translated copies of Aristotle, and they started bringing those back. Further, the writings that we have of Aristotle, for the most part, appear not to have been intended for publication and distribution. Rather, most people think they're something along the lines of lecture notes. Like, I make notes before I do a podcast here. So in my notes, I might write a 3 or 4 word sentence, and from that I'll remember, I'm going to need to talk about this and give this example. So there are occasionally some places where people think there's maybe some gaps in Aristotle's reasoning where it isn't that he made a mistake, it's just we're looking at his notes, not something that he intended to be widely read. And there's also a significant gap in the history of Aristotle's texts, as he would have produced them somewhere around 360 to 322 BC, give or take a little bit, and they were later published and edited by Tyrrhenian of Amas. I'm sure I'm horrifically mispronouncing that, as I always do, and Andronicus of Rhodes, and that was in about 60 BC. And so the point is there's about a 260 to 300 year gap in the history of the texts, where it's not really clear where they were or who had them. Further, it's now well accepted that these two guys edited Aristotle's works before they published them. In other words, they went in and changed things and tried to clarify things. Now, they were Aristotelian philosophers, so they were not trying to do it in a malicious sense, but in a positive sense. But we are very confident they actually changed some things. So for roughly about 300 years, we don't know who had Aristotle's texts or what they did with them, and they were edited by people other than Aristotle at least once. Now, as I said before, Aristotle came back into prominence after the Crusaders went east and started bringing back translations of his texts, and that's because places like Baghdad had preserved many of these works. Now, these works had been translated out of Greek and into Arabic, and they were preserved for those thousands or so years in the Islamic world. Now, after the Crusades brought more contact between the Islamic and Christian worlds, the Christian philosophers and scholars began to realize that the Muslims had these Aristotelian works that they didn't have, so they set about translating these works from Arabic to Latin, which was the scholarly language at the time. Now, sometimes, to make these translations work, they had to use an intermediary language. That is, they would translate it from Arabic to, say, Spanish, and then from Spanish to Latin. And so the point here is, if you read Aristotle in English today, you are guaranteed to be reading something that has been edited and changed at least once by one other person, or maybe two, and that was never intended for distribution, and that has about a 300-year gap in its textual history, and that has been translated at least 4 times, if not more. Now, you'll often hear people claim about the Bible, oh, it's been translated too much, when in reality, virtually every modern translation you have has been translated from the original Greek and Hebrew 1 time, not 4 times. Or they'll claim things like, well, we don't know what the original copies were, there's too much ambiguity. Or they'll claim that, say, too much time passed between the composition of the Gospels and the earliest copies we have. But it's not 300 years that is missing in the textual history of the Gospels. It's more somewhere between 50 and 100 years, depending on who you read on it. It's a controversial subject, but no one is seriously claiming it's 300 years or more. It's a lot less than that. And there really isn't any actual evidence that anybody went in and later re-edited what, say, Mark wrote, what Matthew wrote, and what Paul wrote, and so on and so forth. In fact, as I'll mention later, due to the science of textual criticism, when some changes or mistakes were made, we can actually point that out and get a better idea of what the original actually said. So, Aristotle's texts have all these problems, and yet again, as I'm sure you're catching on to here, virtually no one concludes that we don't know anything about what he wrote and said, and we can't have any certainty about it. In fact, it's really quite the opposite. We know with about as much certainty as you can know a historical event that, say, Aristotle discovered or formulated the laws of logic, taught the golden mean, gave one of the first cosmological arguments for the existence of God, talked about his 4 causes, and so on and so forth. Now, this isn't a point that I've often heard brought up in discussions about whether or not we can trust Scripture, and I'm not sure why. Maybe there isn't as much crossover between people who do scholarly work in philosophy and apologists as there should be. But the point is, every single objection that I've ever heard anybody raise as to why you can't trust what the Gospels say about Christ and the Christmas story and so on actually does apply to many of these texts that we get knowledge of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. These problems really are there when we're talking about those texts. And no one who does serious work in them then concludes the radical and ridiculous things that these skeptics want you to conclude about the Bible, like, oh, Jesus didn't exist, we don't know anything about what he said, later people changed it, and so on and so forth. Nobody concludes that about the text that we get knowledge of Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato from. Now, when you're looking at a document, a historical text, something that's making a claim, there's 2 appropriate questions you have to ask. The first is, do we reliably have the same as what the author wrote? And the second is, did the author write the truth? So a better way to say that first one is, did, say, the text of Luke get fundamentally changed or distorted between the time Luke wrote it down and what we have now, what I read when I picked up the Bible and read the opening of it? Is it the same, or at least mostly the same? And the second question is, did Luke really write the truth, or was he lying? Was he fabricating things? Was he a bad historian who made a lot of mistakes? That kind of thing. Now, when it comes to questions of whether or not Luke was lying, I'm going to say for the moment we should conclude He wasn't, because he tells us from the get-go what his methodology was and that he was trying to be accurate. He says, I went and talked to people who are eyewitnesses, and I've recorded what they said here. And as a general rule, you should take what people say seriously, unless you have a good reason not to. So, if we go through it all and we find out Luke gets a lot of the details wrong, we catch him lying elsewhere, then we can therefore conclude he's not trustworthy. So, for example, let's say Luke had written some other books, and we know that those are pretty bad, they're full of errors, we catch him lying in those other books, well then we would have a reason to doubt what he's saying here. But we don't, so just as a principle of charity, when somebody says they're telling you the truth, take it at face value that they're telling you the truth until and unless you have a reason not to. That's how we all interact with each other on a day-to-day basis, and it's a wise and good way to do it. If I went through my life assuming that everyone I met was lying to me until proven otherwise, I'd have a very difficult time getting through the world, and you would too. So now back to that first question, do we reliably have the same thing that the authors wrote? Well, there's very good both internal and external evidence that we have what the biblical authors wrote to about 99 to 99.5% accuracy, maybe a little more. Now, it's a well-documented historical fact that the Christian movement, the rise of Christianity, came out of Judaism. And we have a pretty good idea of how rigorous and thorough the Jewish scribes were when they were copying religious texts. We have the great example of the Dead Sea Scrolls for that. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in Israel in the late 40s, after World War II, and it was near the Dead Sea. That's why they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what these were a collection of scrolls that had been left in pots that were hidden in caves from shortly before the time of Christ, and it was copies of the Old Testament, the Jewish Torah. They were left there by a group of people called the Essenes, and we know that because they left records about themselves as well as copies of the Old Testament, the Torah. They were an apocalyptic and conservative group. If they were around today, we'd probably call them a bunch of fundamentalists. And so naturally it follows that they took their scripture very, very seriously. And so then what people were able to do is compare, well, what is that like compared to what we have today? And prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, most people who studied these things would have said, well, there's going to be massive changes. You're going to see things being added and dropped and so on and so forth. And to everyone's surprise, the discrepancies between, say, the scroll of Isaiah that was found in the Dead Sea Scroll and modern renditions of Isaiah were incredibly small, like 1 or 2%. If I recall correctly, the one that had the most changes was Jeremiah, and it had gotten slightly longer. And this was shocking to everyone, because what it did is it pushed back the oldest copies we have of the Old Testament by about 1,400 years, and we found out that the text had endured mostly unchanged. It was 99% the same, and the differences were relatively minuscule things. A word was added here or there, a little bit of grammar was changed, things along those lines generally. And so what this means is that, roughly speaking, about the same type of people who would have been copying the early Christian texts were so rigorous and thorough that their text was not significantly changed for 1,400 years, and we can demonstrably prove that. And now we know a thing or two about how Jewish scribes copied their scripture and how that process was done. They had to memorize about 4,000 different rules on how to write the scripture out before they could even touch the paper. They were responsible for every stage of the production, from making the calfskin that it was written on. They created a grid with peg and holes and string, so they could make sure that each letter was in the same place to help ensure ease and accuracy. They would even go through the task themselves of preparing the ink from gull nuts. They would copy one word at a time, first saying the word, then writing it, and then saying the word again. If they ever made a mistake on, say, God's name, they'd scrap the whole document and start it over again completely. Every single letter of the Old Testament, over 300,000 of them, had to be written to a prescribed set of strokes. They had to write by candlelight with a feather quill with ink that would necessarily bleed and run, but the letters couldn't touch to avoid any possible miscommunication or error in there. In a sense, these scribes, well, not in a sense, what's actually what it was, this was a lifetime of back-breaking, extreme labor. It's so different now, where it's so easy for us to copy and write text, that it's even difficult to comprehend how incredibly difficult and meticulous this was then. and the Jewish scribes took so much more effort in it than even other scribes did because they felt they were dealing with the very words of God. So when people claim things like, oh, the Bible was just given to us by a game of telephone where one scribe passed it on to another who may have changed it, to another who may have changed it, and so on and so forth, these people really don't know what they were talking about. The level of dedication and attention to detail these scribes showed is absolutely extraordinary. And that's not to claim that there never were any errors. There have been some that have popped up in copies, and I'll address that a little later. But it's to say that it's not at all the same thing as somebody just repeating one message to another from another person. It's very rigorous and very detailed, and that's not the kind of thing where random errors just pop up all the time. It doesn't work that way. So in the few cases where there are errors or variants, how do we know those are errors or variants? Well, the first piece in that is that there are more physical copies of the New Testament than there are of any other ancient document. And the numbers on these change a little bit from time to time as more documents are discovered. But just for example, Julius Caesar wrote some ancient documents from I think it was called the Annuals of the Gallic Wars or something along those lines. Those were written from approximately 100 to 44 BC. The earliest manuscript we have is over 1,000 years later, and there are only 10 copies of those manuscripts. As I was talking earlier, Plato wrote from about 420 to about 350 BC. The earliest manuscripts we have from that are 1,200 years later, and there are only 7 copies of those manuscripts. Another ancient writer, Thucydides, wrote from 460 to 400 BC. The earliest manuscripts we have from him are 900 AD. That's about 1,300 years later. There's only 8 copies of those. Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, he wrote in about AD 100, so a little bit after the time of Christ. The earliest manuscripts we have of him are about 1,000 years later, and there's only 20 copies of those. Suetonius, who wrote, again, Roman guy, from about AD 75 to 160, the earliest manuscripts we have from him are 800 years later, and there's only 8 copies of those. Now, the best attested ancient document we have other than the New Testament is Homer's The Iliad. It was written probably around 900 BC. The earliest manuscripts we have are from 400 BC, so there's about a 500-year time gap there, and there's 643 copies of that. Now compare that to copies of the New Testament. It was written somewhere between about, say, depending on who dates it, AD 40 or AD 60 to about AD 100. The earliest manuscripts we have of it are from AD 125. There's a fragment that, if I remember correctly, is from, I want to say, the Gospel of Mark, that dates to about AD 125 to 150, somewhere along those lines. Which means there's a time span of, depending on how you date it, about 30 to maybe 50, 70 years there. Very, very short when compared to other ancient documents. And very key is that there's over 24,000 copies and fragments of the New Testament. And of those 24,000, more than 5,800 of those copies are in the original language. Some of them are copies that were translated into other languages like Latin, which was the academic language of the time, or at least a little bit later it was. Now, you'll recall earlier I talked about how Aristotle's works have all these various problems, but nobody who studies Aristotle really doubts very much about who he was and what he did and so on and so forth. Well, Aristotle's works are so bad in comparison to the 7 I just listed here that they typically don't even appear on charts like this that are comparing ancient documents because they just don't even begin to compare. There's that many less manuscripts and the time period is that much worse. So the point here is that if somebody's going to claim there's not very good evidence for the New Testament, they don't know what they're talking about, and if they're going to apply that consistently, they have to throw out virtually every other ancient document that there is, because it's so much better attested than every other ancient document that we're aware of. And 2 further points. There are more than 120 New Testament manuscripts that date back to within 300 years from the originals. And further, even if we didn't have all these manuscripts, we could still reproduce the entire New Testament from the writings of the Church Fathers. There are more than 1 million quotations of the New Testament in the writings of the Church Fathers. And that also gives us another way to check and recheck the writings of the New Testament, where if the New Testament Fathers, say, quoted the Gospel of Mark, and then you've got a manuscript of the Gospel of Mark that doesn't match up, well, that's a way you can check that. Now, you'll often hear people claim things like, oh, there are more than 400,000 variations in the manuscripts we have of the New Testament. And that's true, but it's misleading when they say that number. Because, naturally speaking, if you're going to have more copies of the text, you're going to have more variations. And that's even the case now when we can reproduce things digitally and electronically and by print, when it's not done by hand, which is a little more prone to error. If you go and run 1 million copies of a book in a printing press, you'll probably come up with a couple of errors, where if you, say, ran a print of 10, very unlikely you'd come up with any errors or variations. And furthermore, having this many documents and this many variations is actually a good thing, because that's what enables us to do textual criticism and get a better idea of what the original actually said. If we just had 2 variations and 2 variations alone in 2 manuscripts, we'd have no way of determining which one was original. But when you have more variations and more documents, you can actually then start to do some deductive and inductive reasoning and figure it out. So here's how this works. This is a very rough sketch of how the science of textual criticism works. First, there was an original document. Say in this example, it's the Gospel of Mark. Then copies were made of that original. Then copies were made of those copies, and then copies were made of those copies, and so on and so forth. Now, it's true that we don't have the original of any of the New Testament documents. We don't have the original of any ancient document, at least as far as I'm aware. Maybe there's one exception out there, but if so, that's an exceptionally rare thing. Some people have argued that we also don't have the first copies of the original. However, this actually may not be so. The church father Tertullian indicated that some of the originals were still around when he was writing at the end of the 2nd century. And we have a fragment from about 90 to 125 AD, maybe a little later, as well as some other fragments that are dated to 170 to 220 AD. So it's at least somewhat possible, maybe even plausible, that these fragments were copied from the original. If the originals were still around when Tertullian was writing, then these could have easily been copied from them. Further, copying text doesn't work like a game of telephone. Scribes don't make a copy and then toss out the original they were copying from. The originals would have continued to be used, and there's evidence that indicates papyrus documents could have been used for up to 100 years. That's what they wrote on at the time the Gospels were composed, was papyrus documents. The agnostic and very skeptical scholar Bart Ehrman even admits that a manuscript can be directly copied from one 100 years prior to it in his book called The Text of the New Testament. So that being the case, if these facts are accurate, and Tertullian was telling the truth that some of the originals were still around when he was writing in the late 200s, then it's entirely possible those fragments we have were copied from the originals. So the way this works is the copies would travel down kind of in a line. And it's more complicated than this, but say, for example, there were 2 lines of copies. There was a copy 1 and copy 2. And in copy 2, a scribe made a certain error. Say he changed the grammar or something like that. Well, then if another scribe copies from copy 2, he's going to make that same error. Because as far as he knows, it's not an error. And then you're going to see that same error, that same variation, traveling down the manuscript line. And that's how you can then turn around and trace that back and say, oh, well, all these manuscripts came from the same line because they all have this same variation. And there's some other things that come into play with that too, like the location the document was written in. So the point here is that when you see the same variation in multiple texts, you can be pretty well assured, you can say it's very plausible that they were all copied from the same source. They were all copied from that same original copy. This is further strengthened by the fact that the New Testament documents were so widely distributed that there were copies of the Gospels and epistles all over the ancient Roman world. Hence, there are copies in Alexandria, Syria, and Rome that are easily identified as coming from those locations. And if you just think practically and realistically, no one from Rome is going to travel all the way to Alexandria to make a copy of the Gospel of Mark if they have a copy of the Gospel of Mark in Rome. They're just going to go copy from the one in Rome. Why embark on an expensive and potentially very dangerous trip when you can just make a copy right there where you are at? So you wind up with things like Roman, Alexandrian, Syrian, Byzantine texts and other families of manuscripts that we can determine are traced all the way back to the same source. And from comparing these, we can reconstruct the original with some astonishing accuracy. As I said, 99 to 99.5%. There was never any point in time when a single individual, group, or authority had control over the entire New Testament or even all the copies of a single book in the New Testament like Mark, Luke, or Romans. The early Christians who copied the New Testament were a persecuted minority who couldn't enforce anything uniform about Scripture or destroy any other documents or Gospels they didn't like. They didn't have the power or authority to do this. The council where they first affirmed the canon of Scripture, the Council of Nicaea, was nearly 300 years later, which means during that intervening 300-year period, there is no way they could have said, we like these variants, we don't like these, toss all those ones out. Even if they wanted to, there's just no way they could have done that. It was widely distributed everywhere, and they didn't have the authority to step up and do that, or the resources. Combine that with the fact that they're going to use the original documents for as long as possible. Scholars and scribes don't throw out an old text when they copy from it. People like me who like reading philosophy and reading theology and things like that, we get excited when we see an old book. We're not going to read it, copy it, and throw it away. It's not like it's a one-use thing like a game of telephone. As the scholar Dan Wallace said, every time somebody translates the Bible, they don't say, well, I've got to take this manuscript that I translated from and destroy that now. That's stupid. We don't do that. It's never been done in the history of the church. And now, 400,000 variations still sounds like a lot. But the reality is the vast majority of those variations are things like grammar and spelling and word order that doesn't translate. Now, English is a language that depends on word order to help indicate meaning. When I'm talking, your brain is picking up the word order of my sentence and it's using that to identify what's a noun, what's a verb, and so on and so forth. And that's how you're pulling the meaning out of my sentence. Ancient Greek is not like that. Ancient Greek doesn't use word order to indicate meaning. Rather, it uses conjugations and other things along those lines so that you can put the noun anywhere you want in the sentence, you can put the verb anywhere you want in the sentence, and so on and so forth. And so what that means is it's entirely possible to change the word order in Ancient Greek without it all affecting the meaning in any way. But each time the word order changes, that is technically another variation, even though it doesn't change the meaning in any sense at all, and it'll never be able to be translated into English. And further again, all these variations are actually a good thing because every time there's a change in word order like that, the next scribe comes along, copies that change faithfully, and then you're able to do textual criticism and start tracing it back and comparing and contrasting and helping you get back to what the original actually said. So about 90% of those variations are going to wind up being things like grammar and spelling, word order that doesn't translate, or other things that have no bearing. Like about 9% of them are way too late. So there's a variation that might be substantive, but we know that, say, dates to 900 AD, and we know it's a very late change, so it doesn't matter. We know that's not what the original said. And so essentially 99% of the variations are irrelevant as far as meanings go. And the remaining 1% are things that in no way affect any doctrine of Christian belief. They're minor things like, there's a verse, I can't recall where exactly it's from, but the variation is Jesus got upset or Jesus got mad. And that's a serious variation where textual scholars dispute whether it actually says he got upset or he got mad. Well, that's technically a change in meaning. It really doesn't have any effect on what you believe about Christ or Christianity. And if it does, there's probably something else going on there that you need to address. And the science of textual criticism has actually enabled us to have even better biblical translations than people say 500 years ago did. Good examples of these are the ending of the Gospel of Mark and John 7:53 through 8:11. They included these when they translated the King James Bible back in the 16th century? I don't feel like going and looking that up right now. It was when they translated the King James Bible. Anyhow, the ending of Mark shows Mary Magdalene telling the people she has seen Jesus and them not believing her, and Christ appearing to the disciples, teaching them, and being called up into heaven. It's in many ways an abbreviated version of the ending of Luke, John, and Matthew. However, now that we have access to far more and far better manuscripts than the translators of the King James Bible did, we now know that the earliest and best copies of Mark actually end at 16:8. And it's highly likely you go open up any Bible you have on your shelf, go look at the ending of Mark, and it's going to have a note there saying, hey, the best manuscripts we have, the best evidence we have, indicates that this ending was not original to the Gospel of Mark. And it's likewise with the story in John of the woman caught in adultery. We now know that the earliest and best copies of John didn't have that story. The translators of the King James Bible didn't have access to these manuscripts we have, and didn't have access to the science of textual criticism because it hadn't been developed yet. But now we do, so we know that there are better and earlier manuscripts that didn't have these variations. And I've heard some biblical scholars talk specifically about the story of the woman caught in adultery, and they suspect what it is a tradition that was circulating in the early church, where it probably is a story of something Jesus did that people really liked, and they were trying to find a way to put it in the Gospels because it's a good story that sounds an awful lot like Jesus. Now, another thing people will often claim about the New Testament is that it was written way too late after the fact. Wasn't it written 30, 40, maybe even 50, 60 years after the crucifixion? And that's not really true. These people don't understand what they're talking about. The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ happened 30 to 33 AD. No one's really sure exactly, but somewhere in that time frame. Then you have Paul starting to write the epistles that he writes 50 to 63 AD. These are things like Romans, Galatians, and so on and so forth. So that means Paul is starting to write about this 17 to 20 years after the crucifixion. Further, the Gospel of Mark is composed, depending on who you talk to about it, somewhere around 60 to 73 AD. Scholars vary about when they date that. So that means Mark is produced somewhere between 27 and 43 years after the crucifixion. Now that might sound like a lot to you at first, but let's do some comparison here. There was a few years ago, HBO made a very, very great series about World War II called Band of Brothers. Now that series was based on a book published in 1993 by the historian Stephen Ambrose that was published more than 50 years after World War II. And further, the historian Stephen Ambrose was not an eyewitness to any of those events. What he did is he went and talked to all the people who were involved in it, looked at documents, researched evidence, and then wrote down everything that he said. Now that sounds suspiciously a lot like what Luke actually claims he did at the beginning of his gospel. So, what we can conclude here is if the New Testament was written too late, then so's pretty much all of World War II history that's being written now. I mean, for goodness sake, people are still writing history now about ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and so on and so forth. The fact that we're now thousands, maybe hundreds, or in the case of World War II, decades removed from it, doesn't mean you're not able to write good history. For example, the best sources on Alexander the Great are written 400 years after his life. And you'll often hear people claim that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. Now, Luke clearly claims that he's not an eyewitness. He says he went and talked to the eyewitnesses, and he's repeating what they told him. But I would say that that's actually probably not the case with Matthew and Mark. They probably were written by eyewitnesses named Matthew and Mark. Church tradition and the early Christian church fathers tell us that Matthew was composed by the disciple Matthew. Now, since when you go read the Gospels, you find that Matthew was a tax collector, it would make perfect sense that he would be educated enough to speak and write Greek, which is what the Gospel of Matthew was composed in. Further, the Gospel of Mark was probably written by John Mark, who's mentioned in Acts 12, 13, and 15. According to the Church Fathers, John Mark did write Mark, and he's thought to have been a disciple of Peter. We learn in Acts that his mother Mary had a large house in Jerusalem where Peter went after his miraculous escape from prison. From this, it's reasonable to infer that John Mark's family was wealthy, as it's pretty likely only the wealthy would have had a large house in the city then. Further, it's reasonable to conclude that John Mark was educated and spoke Greek, as the wealthy tended to do both of that then. And further, I think it's also reasonable to infer that John Mark would have probably been an eyewitness to at least some of the things Christ did in Jerusalem. How many mothers do you know who are very religious who don't drag their sons to every religious event they can? So, very likely his mother, as a follower of Christ, would have dragged her son to everything that Christ was doing that she could have got to, because that's what most religious mothers do. Now, there's a whole lot more things I could say about this topic, but I'm only going to give you one further line of evidence here, otherwise this would last 3 or 4 hours. And I really doubt anybody wants to listen to me yammer on for 3 or 4 hours. So this line of evidence is with the way names come across in the Bible. Now, names are very hard to remember and get right. I can just give you a good, easy example of this. I'd been living in the town of Springfield, Missouri for about 8 years before I met my wife, and I've been living there about 9 years at the point that we were engaged. Now, some people from my wife's family's church wanted to throw us an engagement party, and my wife told me they were going to have it at Cooper Estates. My wife's maiden name is Cooper, so I said, so we're going to have it at your parents' house then. I thought she was making a joke that her parents' house was, Cooper Estates. Well, no, she wasn't. Cooper Estates is a fairly nice, gated community in Springfield, and some people who were involved lived there, and they were going to use the clubhouse to throw us the engagement party. It was very nice of them. Now, I'd been living there 9 years when this happened. I had no idea that Cooper Estates even existed. And that's because names like that are difficult to remember and difficult to get right. I could have told you the name of the street I was living on or the name of the apartment I was in, but I'm not going to be able to tell you the name of, say, 5 or 10 other apartment complexes that were in Springfield, or 5 or 10 other estates, or 5 or 10 other housing complexes, because names are difficult to get right. So now with that in mind, let's say I asked you to write a story that was set in the countryside in, say, France or Germany 100 or 150 years ago. Do you think you could get the names of the towns, streets, and people right? Well, now that we have the internet, maybe if you did a bunch of research, you went and looked at library documents and things along those lines, you could do it. But it would be very hard to do. You'd have to do a lot of research. And further and more importantly, could you not only get the names of your characters and towns and streets and so on right, but could you get them right with the same proportion and frequency with which they actually occurred? So I don't know if this is the case at all. I'm just kind of pulling this out of thin air. But let's say 150 years ago, 30% of the people, men in Germany, were named Hans, and 25% of the women were named Heidi. When you wrote your story, would you get that about right? Would you have, say, 26% of the females in your story named Heidi and 31% of the men named Hans? Well, that would be extraordinarily difficult for you to do. Again, with the internet now, and you do a lot of research, maybe you could do that. But go back to when the New Testament and the Old Testament was composed, to when Scripture was being written. They didn't have the internet. There's no way they could have done a lot of research on that. Stories are very easy to remember. You can remember details and plot, what happens, and so on and so forth. But names tend to be very difficult to remember. The last movie you saw, I bet you could tell me the plot or what was really good about it. You could probably describe the characters to me. But I bet you'd have a hard time remembering the names, especially the names of the side characters who aren't really important, who weren't the main characters. So, here's the point, here's the kicker. The names in the New Testament documents do fit and are in the correct proportion. What we can do is we can compare the names and the proportion of and frequency of the names in the New Testament documents to the names we find in external documents and external sources to the New Testament from that time period, and we find that they fit remarkably well. So we know what people's names were in the past thanks to things like bone boxes and ossuaries and tombs, ancient historians, gravestones, and other inscriptions and so forth, and the Dead Sea Scrolls help us out there. And further from this, we know that the Jewish people in Palestine had very different names than Jewish people who were in Greece, Rome, or Alexandria. Now, both skeptics and believers think that the Gospels and Acts were actually composed outside of Palestine. They were done elsewhere. Oh, and I should note here that this argument and the research I'm referring to here was actually done by a guy named Peter J. Williams, and he has a whole long lecture about this on YouTube. You can look up Peter J. Williams' names in the Gospel on YouTube. You can look up Peter J. Williams' names in the Gospels on YouTube and find it. It's a great lecture. I highly recommend you watch it. I'm just going to summarize some of what he says here. So, since everyone agrees the Gospels were composed at least 2 or 3 decades at the earliest after the events they describe and were composed away from the actual events they describe, that is, Mark wasn't writing in Jerusalem where these events happened, then you would have to conclude, well, it's going to be difficult for him to get the names of his characters right if he's just making it up, or if he's making up frivolous details, like say, oh, maybe he remembers Jesus, but he just made up a bunch of other characters. Well, it should be difficult for him to get the names of the characters right, considering that this is before the internet, when it would have been impossible for him to do a bunch of research. Well, when you look at other ancient sources, what you find is that the top two men's names in Israel at that time period were Simon and Joseph, and they were used about 15.6% of the time. When you look at the Gospels and Acts, those are the top two men's names, and they're used about 18.2% of the time. When you compare the top 9 men's names in Israel, that's 41.5% of all the names, and the top 9 men's names in the Gospels and Acts are used 40.3% of the times. That is, 40.3% of the characters who are male have those 9 names. Now, if Mark and the other Gospel authors are simply recording what other eyewitnesses have told them, or are eyewitnesses themselves, then it makes an awful lot of sense that they're getting the names right and the proportion of the names right. If they're just making it up, this is almost impossible. If they're making a bunch of mistakes, they're just sloppy historians, again, this is almost impossible. And this is further evidenced how, if you look at the later apocryphal and later Gospels, like the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas and so on and so forth, they get the names horribly wrong. They'll still remember Christ and Peter and a few other main names like that, but other than that, they get them horribly wrong. They're just way off base. A further evidence of this is that when you read the Gospels, the very common names have what Williams called a disambiguation. And what he means by that is very well evidenced in Matthew's record of the names of the 12 apostles, which is in chapter 10, verses 2 through 4. First, there's Simon, which is the most common name at the time, called Peter. And Peter's the disambiguation there, where it's Simon called Peter. And then Andrew, his brother. Then James, which is the 11th most popular name, gets the disambiguation of being the son of Zebedee. And John, which is the 5th most popular name, his brother, which gets the disambiguation of being the brother of James, the son of Zebedee. Then Philip, which is the 61st most popular name, meaning very, very uncommon, and Bartholomew, the 50th most popular name, again, very uncommon, so Philip and Bartholomew get no disambiguation. Skipping a bit, you come to Matthew's name, which is the 9th most popular name, and he gets the disambiguation of being a tax collector. Going down to James, the 11th most popular name, he gets the disambiguation of being the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, the 39th most popular name, very rare, doesn't get a disambiguation. Simon, the Canaanian, Simon's the most popular name, he gets a disambiguation, which is not the same one as Peter's disambiguation. And then you go on to Judas. Judas is the 4th most popular name, so he's called Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him, another disambiguation. The point being, common names get something else to identify these people, because there's going to be a lot of people called Simon. There's going to be a lot of people called John, James, and Judas, and so on and so forth, where the very uncommon names, like Philip and Bartholomew, don't. And that's a detail that you would expect if Matthew's an eyewitness himself, or if he's repeating what other eyewitnesses have told him, because when those eyewitnesses are repeating their stories, they're going to repeat how they actually spoke about people. So it's going to be Simon called Peter, or when they're repeating the story, there's going to be multiple Simons, so they're going to have to disambiguate between those Simons. And there's other examples of this in the Gospels too. Simon, as I said, is the most common name, so we get things like Simon the Zealot, Simon called Peter or Caiaphas, Simon the leper, or Simon of Cyrene who carried the cross. Now, according to this research, Jesus was actually a popular name at that time. It was the 6th most popular name in the region. And so when you go read the narratives of the Gospels, what you find is, in the narrative, when the narrator, the person who's writing, Mark, Luke, John, and so on, when they're speaking about Jesus, it's usually just Jesus' name, because the narrator probably figures, well, you know who the Jesus I'm talking about is if you're reading a book about him. But then when you find dialogue where other people are speaking, there's usually a qualifier or a disambiguation added to Jesus' name. So, for example, he might be called Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth, or Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a feature that, again, would be very, very hard to get right and guess right if you're writing 50, 100 years or more after the fact and you're not talking to the eyewitnesses. But if you are an eyewitness, or you're talking to the eyewitnesses and they're telling you the stories of what they saw and heard and so on, then this is pretty much exactly what you would expect. And so the point of all this is that names are a very, very hard detail to get right. And the Gospels and the New Testament seem to get them right based on the best available evidence we have. And so that pretty much rules out that the Gospel authors made it up or were writing way too late after the fact, because if they were, they would not have gotten that detail right. It's nearly impossible that they would do so. This is a detail that is exactly as we would expect it to be if the Gospel authors were eyewitnesses or were getting their information from eyewitnesses. It's not at all like what we would expect it to be if they were making it up later after the fact, if the text had been horribly corrupted, or if it was all a myth or a lie or something crazy like that. And I'll go even a step or two further here and claim that this detail that the names in the Gospels are matching up with the external evidence we have of the very frequency of names from that time period is just so astonishingly close that I think that more or less proves, in as much as you can prove something historically, that the Gospel authors were writing the truth as they saw it. After all, how on earth are you going to get a detail like the frequency of the names of your male characters right, and then get wrong a detail like Christ fed 5,000 people and rose from the dead? One is extremely frivolous when compared to the other. So if you're getting all the frivolous details right, then I think we can probably say you're probably getting the main ones right as well. So I've thrown an awful lot of information at you in this podcast here, so I'm going to sum up a little bit of it here for you. First, can you trust that the Christmas story actually happened? Well, first you need to make a distinction between proof and what we can actually demonstrate, which a lot of people don't really do, and that's a good start, and you should probably do that. Secondly, when you look at other ancient documents, like the ancient philosophers who I like to study, many of them have every single problem that you've ever heard anybody throw at the Bible, and nobody then concludes, well, we can't know anything, what's the point? In fact, we actually know a great deal about many of these ancient philosophers, and many of these details are widely agreed upon by pretty much everybody who studies the subject matter. There are more manuscripts of the New Testament documents than there are of any other ancient document in existence. Possibly some of these fragments that we have are copies of the originals. And using the science of textual criticism, we're able to know with 99 to 99.5% accuracy what the original authors wrote. On top of that, we have the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the Jewish scriptures persevered relatively unchanged for about 1,400 years, and the early Christian scribes came from that Jewish tradition, so they would have had very similar methods and ideas and culture and so on. Further, 99% of the variations we are aware of and can find in the New Testament manuscripts don't matter. They make no difference to the meaning of the Bible whatsoever. And finally, I think this is the biggest point. The Gospel authors get the names of their characters right, and they get the frequency of the names of their characters right. And this is a detail that is pretty much impossible to reproduce. It's not impossible in the strictly philosophical sense in that it's incoherent, but it's practically impossible. There's just no way they could have done that if they weren't actually repeating the stories that people were telling to them or were eyewitnesses themselves. It's just practically impossible that they could have done that. This is, in my opinion, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the veracity of the New Testament documents. And go look up that lecture that Peter J. Williams gives on this subject on YouTube. It's great. I couldn't recommend it more highly. So, this being Christmas, if somebody comes to you and says, oh, there's no evidence the Christmas story happened, we don't know anything about this, etc., etc., they don't know what they're talking about. Tell them some of these details, because they're quite astonishing and they're not as well known as they should be. We absolutely can trust that when the Gospel authors write that Christ was born in Bethlehem, that's what happened. There's no real good reason to doubt it, and as I just listed, there's tons of good reasons to believe it, that's the case. There's a whole bunch of other reasons that I left out here, because again, I don't think you want to listen to me drone on for 3, 4, 5, 6, or 8 hours, because, well, even 8 hours wouldn't be enough to list all the evidence and good reasons we have in favor of this. So now why don't you tell me what you think? Do you find this evidence with the names being right in their frequency as compelling as I do? I, again, think that's quite astonishing. Do you think it's not very good evidence for some reason? Write in and tell me. Are you aware of some other evidence and reasons to think the Christmas story is true and we can trust the Gospels that you find really compelling and I left out? Well, write in and tell me. And as always, you got any suggestions or ideas for other topics I should cover here? Write in and tell me. So, I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas, and I will talk to you again next week. Thanks again for listening.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.